Lessons 4.3 and 4.4. Why are there contradictory messages about good and bad foods? The goals of this lesson are to interpret results from actual nutrition studies, to see an example of how the methods used in a study limit the conclusions that can be made, and to see how study results can be misinterpreted to give incorrect nutrition recommendations. At the end of this lesson, students should be able to explain how experimental design produces limitations in the ability to interpret results, explain that if a study does not prove causation, that data may support more than one conclusion, and explain how limitations in experimental design account for the fluid nature of nutritional information provided by the media. We'll achieve these goals by completing the case study called Diets, Which One is Best? To prepare for this lesson, you will need to review the key scientific concepts that are presented throughout the lesson. These include the association between dietary fats and heart disease, and the elements of study design, including types of bias. You can review this scientific content in the background reading provided for you in the teacher primer, the teacher manual, and the student workbook. The teacher primer provides in-depth knowledge about the scientific content presented in this lesson. The teacher manual or lesson plan provides minute-by-minute explanation of the lesson structure, including instructions on how to manage the discussion and the activity. The student workbook provides additional explanations for the students. You will need to print one case study worksheet per student. The key points of this lesson's do now are to engage students in the lesson by asking them to brainstorm diets that they have heard of, and that the Atkins and the Mediterranean diet both claim to be healthy but are very different diets. The Atkins is high in all fat, high in protein, and carbohydrate-free, whereas the Mediterranean diet has a focus on high intakes of unsaturated fat. We'll get there by having a brief Socratic discussion with the students. You can use the do now of this lesson to both engage the students, but also to review the differences between saturated, unsaturated, and trans-unsaturated fatty acids. If needed, you can review this information for yourself in the teacher's manual or the teacher primer. The key points of this lesson's activity are that results from actual scientific studies don't always match our hypotheses, and that the types of methods used in a study limit the conclusions that can be made. We'll get there by having students complete a case study. This case study starts out with having students make a prediction about the health consequences of the Atkins and the Mediterranean diets. Students will then use your worksheet to design a study to measure their hypothesis. Through the rest of the case study, you will provide students with evidence from 2 actual studies in increments, asking them to predict, describe, and interpret evidence as they go. Both of the studies look at associations between the incidence of cardiovascular disease and the diet type, either Atkins or Mediterranean. By the end of the case study, students should see that the reason the data don't support their hypothesis is because of the way the 2 studies were designed. Students will use the case study worksheet to help them focus on the important details of the data. The worksheet asks students to explain what the data suggest and explain whether the data is consistent with their predictions. You can review all of this information in the case study worksheet answer key. It has everything organized just as your students will be organizing it. Additionally, the teacher primer and the teacher manual go over the key scientific concepts. The key point of this lesson's wrap-up is that dietary advice shifts because many times recommendations are made from a single inconclusive study before waiting for a meta-analysis to be conducted. We'll get there by having a short discussion with the students. Students should see that even though studies we saw in today's case study had results contrary to their hypothesis at the beginning of class, it doesn't mean that their hypothesis is disproven. The key point of this lesson's homework is how you view scientific results may shift depending on who you are. We'll get there by having students complete their case study worksheet. Students will answer the homework questions on the worksheet in which they are asked to evaluate the data as different stakeholders. Students should use the results from the case study to act as a physician making recommendations to a patient, and to form a marketing campaign to advertise the healthfulness of the Atkins diet. Depending on your class, you may want to split this case study into 2 days. Students will get the most out of this case study if they are engaged in a lot of conversation, so feel free to dedicate extra time if possible. One of the most challenging aspects of this lesson is that it can end without a strong resolution, and some students and teachers struggle with this feeling of not having conclusive results. Another challenge is the interpretation of the graphs, especially the graph with 2 y-axes that appears on slide 15. The reason for showing the 2 y-axes is so the trends of the 2 groups is more readily apparent. Give your students time to interpret this graph before moving on to slide 16, which shows the same data but with 1 axis. At the end of the lesson, students should be able to explain how experimental design produces limitations in the ability to interpret results. Explain that if a study does not prove causation, that data may support more than one conclusion, and explain how limitations in experimental design account for the fluid nature of nutritional information provided by the media. This lesson uses the study design content taught in Lesson 4.2, along with students' knowledge of fat from Lesson 1.5 and 2.1, and information about how dietary fat is associated with heart disease from Lesson 3.6. Don't forget that if you have any questions, concerns, or feedback to let us know. You can contact any of the CTS team members and we would be happy to help you.